Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the National Conference on Race and Ethnicity webinar series. NCORE is part of the Southwest Center for Human Relations Studies at the University of Oklahoma in Norman. My name is Dedrick Perkins, and I am the Senior Program Coordinator, and I'm very delighted to welcome you all here and to be your host this afternoon. Our hope is that we continue the conference tradition of working to improve racial, ethnic, and intercultural relations on college campuses and community organizations by providing virtual learning with opportunities like this one. So for those of you who are joining us for the very first time, we at NCORE, we do have a monthly webinar series, and they happen on the first and last Wednesday of each month, with the occasional exceptions like for holidays and things like that. Some of the webinars are free, others are offered at a very modest fee of $25. Our next webinar is, don't forget, Disability is Diversity Too. It will be presented on March 29th by Lamont Sellers with Appalachian State University. So please visit our website for a full list of webinars for this season. Before we get started, and I introduce today's presenter, I simply wanted to go over some housekeeping items. So first, if you need to utilize the closed captioning, make sure your settings are set for on. Always remain muted unless you are being requested to unmute. We ask that your background have no moving images or flashing lights. If you have any specific tech, accessibility, or any other kind of operational concerns, you can connect with me via direct message. I am the session host. So if you do, we will have a question and answer section in the last half of the session. So we ask that you use the raise your hand feature during that time. So I would suggest if you have a question, just writing it down real quick, and then we'll go over them at the end. Now help me welcome today's presenter, Dresden Frazier from the University of San Francisco.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm actually going to just immediately screen share and hop into my presentation, but we do have a hand raise, which I saw a comment in the chat that it's not on speaker view. So if Giovanni or Dedrick can check on that, that would be great, but I'm going to go ahead and move to the screen share. Alrighty, I'm hoping somebody will let me know if you can't see this, but otherwise I'm just going to get rolling here. So welcome to I'm Black Before I'm an Athlete, College Athlete Activist, and Blackness as a Transformational Force. I am Dresden June Frazier, and my pronouns are she, her. I'm a PhD student at UC Riverside studying higher education. My research for the last 6 years has been centered on the experiences of Black athletes, in particular, the ways that they navigate their racial identity as college students and athletes. I was a walk-on non-scholarship Division I track and field athlete at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. So much of my research interest comes from my experiences as a Black athlete, but also being around my friends and seeing their experiences, in particular as scholarship athletes at Cal Poly. I also work for the University of San Francisco's Leo T. McCarthy Center for Public Service and the Common Good, where I support undergraduate tutors in deconstructing white savior narratives and learning about how they can engage in service and community engaged work as an anti-racist ally and as an accomplice. Today, I'll be talking about some research I did with Black athlete activists. I asked athletes to reflect on their motives to participate in the 2020 wave of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I prompted them to really think about how they evaluated the risk that participating in activism posed to their athletic position. First, I'll take you through a short land acknowledgement. We'll talk a little bit about the context of 2020, talk a little bit about NCAA policies and the history of the NCAA, a little bit about the history of race in athletics. I'll briefly touch on the methods, and then we'll really dive into the core findings relating to Black identity salience and the transformational nature of that identity connection. Lastly, you will have the opportunity to ask me some questions, and if there's time, I have a couple questions for you as well. I do want to give a content warning because this presentation does include discussions about state-sanctioned violence against Black bodies, so I want people to be aware of those topics. As a staff member of the University of San Francisco, built on the unceded land of the Ramaytush-speaking people of the Yelamu tribe, one of approximately 50 independent nations now referred to as the Ohlone, I honor and acknowledge the rich cultural heritage that has survived colonization and genocide, and I honor Ohlone past, present, and future. In the Bay Area, I continually learn from the Segorite Land Trust, an organization led by urban Indigenous women that facilitates the return of Indigenous land to Indigenous people. Their organization suggests that we should all learn the history of the land that we are on, learn the relationship of our own family line to stolen land, find out about issues impacting Indigenous communities in our area. We should study settler colonialism, dismantling white supremacy, unsettling, land return, and rematriation. We should learn about local sacred sites and take action to protect them, learn about the pressing environmental issues where we are and take action, and really do our part to shift and redistribute resources to communities who have historically had those resources extracted from them. We have mourned the loss of George Floyd for almost 3 years now. And as a Black person, as a researcher, as an academic, as an activist, I can not really begin any of these conversations without touching and talking about his personhood and his humanity. Because though many of us refer to him and his murder as this phenomenon and it reignited a movement, first and foremost, he was a person, and he left behind his daughter Gianna, who described her father as strong and good. Black activists today fight for George Floyd, for the endless lives, peace, and bodily mobility that have been taken by state-sanctioned violence, and for kiddos like Gianna who deserve to live in a carefree world. It is important to understand the context that Black athletes were in 2020, so I'll do a little recap here. However, we all lived and are living in the pandemic, so I don't need to explain that to you. I did want to highlight just a few facts, though. The CDC shows that Black and brown people have been more likely to be hospitalized, develop MIS-C, a disease which comes in children and results from COVID-19, and are more likely to also die of COVID-19. In 2020, we also saw a wave of Black Lives Matter protests after the murder of George Floyd. During the summer of 2020, over 4,700 protests occurred across the nation with an estimate of 15 to 26 million participants. Within this wave of Black Lives Matter protests, athlete activism also increased severely. Professional and college athletes alike took a stand against racism, and they really used their platforms to demand justice. The NBA led a walkout over the non-fatal shooting of Jacob Blake, which triggered a whole cascade of boycotts and walkouts across the sporting world. And these protests ultimately led to a deal with the NBA to utilize their facilities as polling places where citizens could vote. In the college athletics world, a coalition of athletes led a campaign called We Are United, which demanded better treatment by universities and intercollegiate athletics, and the intercollegiate athletics regulating body, which is the NCAA. And this coalition listed the NCAA's systematic exploitation of Black athletes and put forth a comprehensive set of demands asserting their rights to COVID-19 protections, an end to racial injustice in college sports and society, and to economic freedom and equity. Athlete activism hasn't been non-existent, but it certainly has been a lot less common than it was in 2020. This was a very, very notable spike. In fact, if you look at news articles, over 50% of news articles ever written on athlete activism were written after George Floyd's murder on May 25th, 2020. So for this study, I wanted to focus on why athletes' behaviors were changing. What were their motives? How were they perceiving the risks? Because as a former college athlete, I know that there are risks, especially if you're engaging in Black activism. In order to talk about activist choices, you really have to understand the contractual relationship that athletes are in with universities and with the NCAA. The NCAA describes itself as a member-led organization dedicated to the well-being and life success of college athletes. It was created in response to faculty concerns that athletics was detracting from institutional academic integrity. So essentially, the NCAA is meant to ensure that college athletes are attending universities to earn a degree. What is happening though is that doesn't really align with reality, because scholars and researchers have found that only about 50% of Black male college athletes actually end up graduating. So the NCAA is clearly not achieving this goal. Race and athletic scholars have critiqued the NCAA for primarily protecting the financial interests of universities by regulating and suppressing athletes. An example of this contractual nature is that athletes have to sign an NIL to indicate their official commitment to an institution. This then guarantees them 1 year of financial aid. And in this process, athletes don't have the opportunity to negotiate the contents of the letter. They basically receive the letter, they can either sign and agree to the terms or not sign and risk their scholarship opportunity. Though the signing of the NIL is often an exciting time for athletes, and they got like the backdrop and the balloons and, you know, you have your little signing party. This contract really is athletes' moment where they sign away control of their lives. It binds them to rules that can regulate their hairstyles, their hair color, their attire, and department policies that can tell you whether or not you can participate in activism both on campus and off campus. So within this structure of contractual compliance, what happens when an athlete is suspected of violating an NCAA policy? Well, prior to thorough investigation, if an athlete is suspected of violating an NCAA policy, then they're deemed ineligible to compete and they are removed from their team. In the current structure, college athletes are basically guilty until proven innocent, and they often bear the consequences of the accusation, even if they're deemed innocent in the end. This is really founded on an imbalance of power and punishment, inflicting harsh penalties on individual athletes for violations and really proportionally light sanctions on athletic departments, because universities bend these rules as they please, whereas athletes have to follow them strictly. An example here would be that research conducted on 409 college athletes from 9 different universities in the Pac-12 found that athletes spend about 50 hours a week on athletics. But there's an NCAA rule that says that departments can't make athletes spend more than 20 hours a week on athletics. So in the study, they found that most of those extra hours were voluntary, but the general consensus among participants was that those voluntary hours were in fact mandatory within the culture of athletics, because you can't disappoint your coach and you can't disappoint your teammates. And athletes also know that their coaches have the power to remove their scholarships, which for a lot of Black athletes mean removing them from the entire institution. These institutional violations impact athletes' ability to meet NCAA compliance standards that are placed on them, like GPA minimums, and there's no flexibility when they violate an NCAA policy. So they face the compliance burdens, and they have to adhere to these standards, even though they're not given really the environment or opportunity always to adhere to them. Another interesting point is that Black athletes tend to be the subjects of these academic misconduct violations, but Black athletes also describe having little control over their choice in majors and course schedule. Athletic departments have been shown to bend rules, find loopholes, and do all kinds of things in order to maintain the eligibility of their athletes who aren't given the time to focus on school. Advisors have enrolled Black athletes in less challenging classes based on assumptions about their intellectual abilities. And this real narrowing of choices really makes their academic aspirations and their ability to take advantage of the educational opportunity at hand so much lessened. Ultimately, Black athletes graduate at lower rates than white athletes and Black students. Benson interviewed academically at-risk Black athletes, and she found that their deficits in academic performance were not solely due to like a lack of effort or a lack of motivation, but instead a series of interrelated practices that included coaches, advisors, teachers, and then themselves. So there are definitely athletic department influences in the failures to have Black athletes graduate. So far we know that Black athletes' academic careers are managed by the athletic department and they're regulated by the NCAA. Athletes have a contractual relationship with universities, and those contracts enable institutions to make decisions about athletes' appearance and their speech. Specifically, the NCAA manual states an athlete's scholarship may be revoked if the athlete violates a non-athletically related condition outlined in the financial aid agreement or violates a documented institutional rule or policy. This is the policy that is utilized to tell athletes that they can't have locks, or they can't have purple hair, or they can't participate in a protest. This is the policy that is opening the door to racial bias. And this policy was instituted in 1967 after a financially devastating football boycott at San Jose State University that cost the university $100,000, which is upwards we're seeing all kinds of inflation, so upwards of $6,700 or $6,700,000 today. As can be seen in the previous policy, universities are resistant to athletes utilizing their platforms to participate in social activism. Athletics has been pitched as this race-neutral space that exists outside of the social, political, and economic issues of society. The high visibility of Black athletes in revenue-generating sports like football and basketball has created this illusion that racial integration has occurred across the sporting world and that the arena is free of racism. But despite this pervasive delusion, the reality is that sport exists within the confines of American society, and neither the arena nor the players themselves are immune to racism. But social issues relating to race and racism are often contested and labeled as controversial, and the NCAA and universities use complex policies to frighten athletes into submission so that they can maintain the divide between activism and athletics. But while they're doing this, they're maintaining a divide between athletes' Black identities and their athletic identities. Many Black athletes are even indoctrinated into this belief that politics doesn't have a place in athletics and that they're in debt to the university for their admission and their scholarship, so they should just really be grateful. However, colleges and universities have also historically been the site of radical social movements, and Black athletes have been key factors in these movements for Black liberation. Some historical examples of activism in college athletics are the Black 14 in 1969. 14 Black football players at the University of Wyoming requested to participate in a protest, and they were immediately removed from their team just because they requested. Their coach cited his rule against participating in demonstrations as justification for their dismissal. Similarly, nearly 40 years later, UCLA football players also faced backlash when athletic administrators were made aware of a planned athlete protest. The coach's argument against their protest was that the athletes should be happy with their free education, and though they might have a social conscience, football is not the way to do it. At the University of Missouri in 2015, football players worked with the Black Student Union to actually successfully advance a protest against campus racism by boycotting their season until the university's president agreed to step down. But after all of this, fans attacked the players on social media, demanding that they be kicked off the team. And Missouri lawmakers went as far as to propose a bill that would remove the scholarships of athletes who participated in campus activism. These responses reinforce the dominant ideology of whiteness in sport by suggesting that athletes should be grateful for their opportunity and not question their place within institutional hierarchies. The NAACP took on the case for the Black 14 and requested reinstatement of those players and damages for their civil rights violations. But the judge in that case actually ruled against the NAACP and was quoted saying, "I think the fact that the coach went out and solicited and gave scholarships to a large number of colored people is strong evidence that he was not prejudiced against any race." So activism, and in particular, Black racial activism, has long been pushed out of athletics, and that's been seen as completely fine. In 2010, researchers did a study where they sought to understand Black male athletes' perspectives on race and athlete activism in the context of American society, so very similar to my study. But they found that Black athletes felt that although they should use their positions to advocate for their communities, they chose not to because they had more pressing concerns with their personal liberation from the constraints of their race and class, and for the potential of their athletic scholarship to promote their personal social mobility. So this is notably different and more restrained than athletes 10 years later in 2020. So I'm super curious, what changed? What was different? Why was 2020 different? And Harry Edwards, author of The Revolt of the Black Athlete, says the roots of the revolt of the Black athlete spring from the same seed that produced the sit-ins, the freedom rides, and the rebellions, and from his new awareness of his responsibilities in increasingly more desperate, violent, unstable America. And I think he's right. So I aim to ask athletes, how did the realities of 2020 impact their engagement with Black activism? I conducted semi-structured interviews. The participants were 5 Black student athletes who were self-identified Black Lives Matter activists and attended California universities in 2020. I utilized snowball sampling to recruit through social networks, and I allowed the participants to choose their own alias names to keep confidentiality. And some limitations I would say are possible were like the COVID-19 pandemic made recruitment really difficult, and it made people committing to participating really difficult because people were dealing with a lot, of course. And also the sample only included athletes from California, which is really specific. So for the findings, the Black athlete activists of this study found that their engagement in Black Lives Matter was centrally rooted in their identities as Black Americans. While this may seem obvious, this contradicts previous studies that have shown that athletes' allegiances to their racial identity come second to their athletic identity. Like in that 2010 study I mentioned, those athletes saw the importance of their role in activism, but ultimately they decided that their personal liberation from racism was separate from the community's pursuit and was also more important to them. Athletes in 2020 had a distinct shift in loyalty towards their racial group, and I saw this as directly connected to the events that occurred in 2020, specifically the COVID-19 pandemic and the murder of George Floyd. These events increased the Black athletes' racial identity salience. The intense visibility of state-sanctioned violence against Black bodies contributed to athletes' increased awareness of their own race, their vulnerability to anti-Black violence, and their responsibility for the movement for Black lives. This heightened connection to the Black community overshadowed their connection to the athletic community, which de-emphasized their athletic identity and their obligation to athletics, in turn prompting them to engage in Black Lives Matter despite the possible consequences. Participants emphasized a sense of privilege within their roles as athletes and an obligation to utilize their athletic platforms to progress the Black Lives Matter movement and to call attention to injustice. Athletes emphasized a need for unity, and they described how they used collective action to leverage their power against the institution. The participants were highly inspired by professional athletes, and they felt that arena activism in particular is a unique form of protest that simultaneously creates controversy, redistributes power, humanizes Black athletes, and bridges the gap between Black players and white fans. It is important to note, however, that many of the participants shared that they knew athletes or they themselves were athletes who received punishment for engaging in activism and for bringing conversations about Black Lives Matter into athletics. The experiences described by the athletes in this study aligned with Cross's theories on Black identity development. Cross is one of the key theorists in Black identity, and in 1991, he revisited his conceptualization of negrescence to expand and adjust the theory. The study of negrescence, which is a French word meaning the process of becoming Black, evolved in the 1960s as psychologists worked to understand the transformation that Black Americans were experiencing as participants of the Black Power movement. Through this theory, Cross emphasizes that Blackness is a state of mind rather than an inherited trait, and that the development of a Black perspective is in constant struggle against the white normative forces of our society that are constantly working to miseducate Black people. The developmental model has 5 stages, but I'm going to focus on those that are primarily seen in this study. So prior to the events of 2020, it's likely that athletes in this study were situated in the pre-encounter phase of Black identity development. The pre-encounter stage is marked by a low racial identity salience. People in this stage are primarily guided by the white normative education that they received through the formal US education system. They don't really see their race as playing like a highly significant role in their daily life, and instead they have more central identities like their athletic identity. For athletes, their athletic identity is often their most salient identity, and studies have shown that high athletic identity salience can actually be detrimental to academic success. The athletes in this study, however, did not exhibit such a debilitating prioritization of their athletic identity. Instead, they indicated a de-emphasis of this identity in favor of their Black identity. For example, my participant Kami said, "There's more to life than college sports, but improving the lives of people out past athletics is way more important than playing." So 2020 was stage 2, or the next stage, which is the encounter phase. I think we all felt it. I know even after I experienced all these dramatic changes and deepening myself that I went through in college with my own Black identity, 2020 rocked me yet again and sent me down this whole other path of questioning and self-discovery. The encounter phase is marked by an experience that challenges the pre-encounter positionality and is moved forward by a personal attachment to the event. For example, after we lost Obama, we had to go into the Trump years. We were like, oh, okay, maybe this is a fluke, we don't live in a racist country. But then when George Floyd was murdered, a lot of us were confronted with the fact that we do live in a country that has an anti-Blackness problem. And we realized that it wasn't a fluke, that this is the reality that we live in. And these challenging events can be highly impactful and can be an array of things like the death of a public figure like Martin Luther King, a televised racial incident like Rodney King or what we saw with George Floyd, a personal event. It could be something that just happened to you relating to race or racism. And in 2020, we experienced a myriad of racially hostile events that were televised, that were personal to us, that were happening in our homes and out of our homes. And one of the main ones was the COVID-19 pandemic. With regards to the COVID-19 pandemic, participants were primarily concerned with how the pandemic revealed and exacerbated existing racial inequality in the United States. Kami shared that once COVID-19 hit, he was able to see it, and what he was talking about was racial inequity. He also talked about COVID-19 and how it was intertwined in the We Are United movement. And he said that they had meetings regarding COVID-19 safety, but what they were really seeing was severe racial disparities, and specifically the exploitation of Black athletes in college sports. Kami really emphasized to me that the We Are United movement was rooted in income inequality in the Black community, noting that there was a high number of Black players playing in revenue-generating sports, but then never seeing any of the money or success from their labor. Maria described the pandemic as helping her find her voice. She said, "I really found who I was, and I found it was okay to speak about my race out loud during COVID." So again, while COVID protocol in athletics was this hot topic in the media in terms of literal health safety, these athletes were actually focused on the racial disparities that the COVID-19 pandemic revealed. They weren't necessarily talking about the direct danger that COVID-19 posed to them or other Black people, but instead they were talking about the ways in which Black Americans are uniquely vulnerable to things like COVID-19 because of housing inequality, income inequality, and the overarching effects of systemic racism. COVID-19 for them was a symbol for the pervasive impact of racism in America, and that awoke the activism in them. Of course, the killing of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and the merciless shooting of Jacob Blake that circled the news cycles and were constantly in our face were also highly, highly impactful events regarding racial identity salience. With this increased awareness, almost all of the participants made it very, very clear to me that more than anything else, they were Black, and they wanted their teammates and their coaches to understand the reality of what it meant for them to be Black in America. Maria stated, "At the end of the day, when I go on the street, I'm a Black woman, and that's how police are going to see me." She emphasized the emotional difficulty she faced, stating that The shootings and the violence that happened for her as a Black woman with a Black partner and a Black father and Black brothers, that it was hard for her to cope. Zero echoed this sentiment, shifting the tone a little bit in the direction of an activist lens, stating that her mindset was, I'm Black before I'm an athlete. I'm not going to give you what you want if you're not going to give me what I need. This is where I saw grief and pain turning into action, where athletes recognized and took hold of their power. They said, if you're not going to see me as a full human being, deserving of life, deserving of the opportunity to grieve, the opportunity to walk down the street without getting shot, if you're not going to recognize my full humanity as an athlete, then I'm not going to play for you. And this is where boycotts are born. This is where boycotts like the San Jose State or the Mizzou protests happen. This is where athletes reclaim their power in the sporting world. And this is where I really, really see the transformational nature of a salient and nurtured Black identity. Blackness itself is a transformational force freeing Black athletes from the constructs of intercollegiate athletics. And this is what Cross was seeing while he was observing the Black Panther Party. He noticed that Black activists had been transformed by their Black identities, and that this transformation generated a consciousness capable of uniting the Black community, regardless of their social class, in a common struggle towards collective liberation. It was so beautiful to me to hear athletes in this study talking about building coalitions with Black students who are not athletes and collectively advocating for change that would benefit them all. Kami said that they're trying to build a community between athletes and non-athletes of Black people. All of the athletes were very clear that the Black Lives Matter movement was more important to them than their collegiate or professional athletic careers, which within NCAA policy could have been at risk if they wanted to participate in an on or off campus protest, and there was a department policy against that. When I asked Kami about the possible repercussions activism could have on his athletic standing, he firmly stated that he didn't pay attention to the consequences because he knew he was on the right side. He said that he felt a sense of obligation to leverage his platform to benefit the Black community, stating that he couldn't let things go by and not use his platform to push for improvements in the Black community. Alicia also described a sense of responsibility as an athlete with a platform that a lot of people may not have, and she said that she should do whatever she can to elevate the movement. Maria agreed and felt that she had worked hard to get where she was and deserved to utilize her platform as she saw fit. This is really a controversial opinion in athletics. I mean, we all saw what happened to Colin Kaepernick when he decided to kneel. He was and is still ousted from the NFL. But if you consider the places in society where you see Black people with any amount of power or platform, athletics is one of the key areas. And still, people believe that athlete speech should be restrained and that they should shut up and dribble, shut up and play. But if we silence Black athletes, then we're silencing one of the most visible sectors of the Black community. And for college athletes in particular, silencing them is inhibiting their learning. Kami, my participant, is the one that really, really introduced me to that perspective when he told me, even having the fear, shows something's wrong. If a student athlete is afraid to use their voice, how can they really be comfortable and really be themselves and really grow as college students should if they can't effectively use their voice? And athletes in this study were growing and they were learning because of this push that they were given, because of this identity transformation that they were experiencing. Several athletes spoke about the way that African-American studies, independent reading on Black history, and even intergenerational knowledge impacted their understanding and ability to engage in activism. Alicia shared that she was experiencing this anti-Black violence around her and the subsequent protests, and that she was connecting that to and drawing from the knowledge that she had learned in her classes as an African-American studies minor. She thought back to the activists that she had learned about and thought, why not, as a Black woman, take my part and do what I can to further the movement? Maria cited intergenerational knowledge of resistance and oppression, and she shared about her upbringing and how she's a part of a long line of activists, and how her father really spoke to her about activism as she was growing up. She told her grandmother about protesting in the Black Lives Matter protest, and her grandmother was proud of her. Kami called on the words of Fred Hampton to make his case. He said that, Fred Hampton said, Fred Hampton said the power's in the people. And he said, I feel like the more we have movements like We Are United, and the more that we get athletes involved, the more that institutions are going to have to change. But as long as they keep us divided and continue to provide all of these excuses for things, then there's not going to be any change. So athletes were calling upon the knowledge and experiences of their ancestors, of their idols, of activists who came before them. And that is how they were navigating their choices in 2020. And some of them faced consequences that came with bringing activism into the arena. In particular, Maria did. She was told that her coaches were very open to that kind of stuff, but why bring politics into athletics? That's not our place. Maria was even told that if she didn't stand for the national anthem, that she would face consequences during practice. She was threatened and ultimately put in a position where leaving the team was her only option if she wanted to be true to her values as a Black activist. And now she's in limbo. She's being held up in the transfer process with the NCAA, and it's going to take her some time to figure that out if she ever does. She shared that it was really tough for her because she had never missed a game in her whole life, but she refused to be disrespected. She felt that she had to hold herself accountable to what she was willing to put up with. In the end, she was satisfied with her choices. She told me that the consequences for standing up to injustice are always worth it. Again, because of the centrality of her racial identity and the group loyalties that came with that. She deprioritized her concerns for her personal athletics and career success, and she focused on herself and her community. The final stages of Cross's model include immersion and internalization. I talked a little bit already about how athletes immersed themselves, and they did that by joining political organizations, creating organizations, reading Black literature. And this final stage is internalization commitment. This is where athletes can achieve what Cross calls existential Blackness. And he defines that as an understanding of racial identity that is not defined by society's color-based assignments and restraints, but rather by a person's connection to their culture and community. Existential Blackness is the simple act of being unapologetically Black, without concern for the expectations of the dominant culture. I believe that the participants in this study are touching down into existential Blackness. They have managed to elevate beyond athletics to exist as Black people without consideration for what the institution expects from them as Black laborers. They have integrated the Black community's collective liberation with their personal pursuit of freedom. And these are no longer separate or even opposing pursuits, but they're the exact same thing. Cross notes that for the transformation to existential Blackness to have lasting significance, the self must continue to be involved with the resolution of the problems shared by the group. This research has really shown that there's a changing tide of athletes reclaiming their ownership over their own body, over their own voices, over their own industry. By investing in their non-athletic identities, athletes are redefining what it means to be a student athlete. Student athlete is no longer an empty promise or a term used to deceive and oppress. It's actually a rallying cry. It's a demand. College athletes are student athletes. By learning about their histories, by speaking up, by collectivizing, these athletes have unified their two worlds, both academic and athletic. But as a practitioner, I'm interested in how we promote and nurture Black identity development. How do we ensure that people like Maria aren't pushed out of college athletics because of experiencing these transformations and because of deepening their connection to the Black community, engaging in activism? So I think we need to, athletic departments need to take responsibility for this. That's first and foremost. I think that they need to connect athletes to Black academic centers. Black student unions, whatever Black organizations exist on campus. They need to literally create programming. When I was a freshman at Cal Poly, I had a Black coach, which was hugely impactful to my development, but he saw it as important for us to be connected to these resources. So he brought those people to us. He actually spoke with the director of these programs and had this woman come to our track and field practice and speak to us. And then we knew her and we knew where she was, and we felt like we could reach out to her, and we wanted to reach out to her because she had become our friend. So I think that it's important for Black athletes to have access to Black faculty and staff. And again, the athletic department should take the time to build these bridges and also to compensate Black faculty and staff for their labor, because we can't just take one problem and put it on a different group of Black people. But I've looked into a lot of programs, and I have been really impressed with what K-State is doing. They have this PALS mentoring program. It's positioning African-American and Black athletes for lifelong success. In this program, they pair Black athletes with a faculty member, a former student athlete, an upperclassman, a member of the community, someone to assist them with their adjustment to college, into setting their goals, into investing in themselves, not just as athletes. And I think a lot of researchers in athletics have seen that one of our main problems is that athletics is too siloed. Athletes are expected to find everything they need within the walls of the athletic department. What they actually need is to leave and to go outside the athletic department and experience other areas of campus and connect with other parts of themselves so that they can grow and blossom into full human beings. An area of campus that Black athletes could be introduced to is the African American Studies or Ethnic Studies department, if their campus has that. I legitimately didn't know that my university had an Ethnic Studies minor. And currently, the structure of college athletics funnels a lot of athletes into these easy majors. They just tell all athletes, like, go into these majors. We have relationships with teachers. We're going to help you out. But what if they actually let athletes pick what they wanted to do? And what if they introduced them to these possibilities? Maybe they want to learn about their ancestors and their lineage and their experiences in this country and in this society. The athletic department can also host guest speakers that discuss Black experiences. They could bring people in to facilitate workshops. They should definitely hire Black staff and coaches in the athletics department. That's a whole area of athletics research. And they should give athletes the opportunities to be their whole Black selves in the arena, on the field, in practice, as a part of athletics. They should let them be activists and let them have their locks or whatever they want. They should recognize that Black people have humanity, and Black athletes should be allowed to access that humanity as well. The very last thing that I'll say is that college students need guidance and support because they're developing people. And for the most part, Black athletes don't have proper support to adequately engage in this development. Krauss noted that the encounter stage, where you experience that like racial consciousness that sends you down this path of self-discovery and self-empowerment, it actually can be a positive one. It doesn't have to be a trauma. This encounter could be enlightenment. It could be in a workshop. It could be done through these mentorships, these relationships. Athletes could encounter their identity in a positive way. And what would the world look like if we intentionally created those spaces for identity development to occur? How would the experiences of Black athletes at universities be different if they were prompted to engage in the Black community and in their Black identity? So I do want to open the floor for questions and comments. I will drop the screen share. I can't really see it. There we go. It's not letting me click on it. Okay. Zoom is so weird because it layers all the things. I'm going to check the Q&A section just to see what we've got going on here. So you can add questions in the Q&A section if you have questions, and you can raise your hand if you want to verbally ask a question as well. And I'll be looking at that. So I'm seeing a question here that says, did you mention, or did you find that participants mentioned other social identities such as gender or sexual orientation? How did those things interact with their sense of racial identity? So thinking back to my interviews, I had, I think three women identified and 2 male identified athletes. And the women did for sure talk about being women athletes and how those intersections were really present in the ways that they were experiencing their athletics career. A lot of it comes down to that they are seen as less important than male athletes. I remember one of the participants, Zero, she was telling me that she actually felt like she could do whatever she wanted activism wise because nobody cared. She was like, nobody's paying attention to what I'm doing. And a lot of that was related to her gender and being a female athlete, and like that just not being important to universities because nobody's watching her game or her event. Whereas like if they have a basketball player kneeling or a football player kneeling, then, you know, universities are going to get a little more intense about it. So I do think gender plays a role, but those, I would say those are like the core, those are the core ways that I saw gender coming in. How do we introduce Black identity and development to Black athletes in high school so that as they reach colleges and universities, they already have a toolkit to work through the issues that may arise? I mean, all the things I mentioned are so applicable to earlier stages of athletics development. I mean, we see that Black boys in particular are socialized and funneled to think that athletics is the career for them. That's the path for them to be successful. And so offering other things earlier and getting them to engage with other identities, in particular their racial identity, is certainly a great way to deconstruct that and to give them options. I think we're seeing a lot of interest in ethnic studies curriculum, and I work with the San Francisco School District, and in particular, I work with a Black community. And what I've seen there in the Fillmore Western Addition area of San Francisco is they are bringing in Black-centric media, Black staff, Black faculty, and they're really creating these pro-Black spaces that nurture Blackness in a way that kids, high school students, whatever, can be proud of it and want to engage with that identity. So that might not be as specific as you're looking for, but I think it's definitely worth exploring in the secondary education zone as well. Somebody asked that what are the contributing factors to low retention of Black athletes? I think a lot of it is what I described. I think first it's cultural. I think like within the culture of athletics, there is this idea that you are there to be an athlete, not to get a degree. So that's all secondary. So you're just meeting the NCAA compliance minimums, which aren't necessarily going to get you to a degree. And then you're playing, and eventually you run out of playing time, or you get injured, or you find out you're not good enough, and then you drop out of school. And so that, I think, is the first part. I think fighting against that would be allowing athletes to actually engage with their academics and encouraging them to, because speaking of secondary education, this stuff is programmed into their minds early. So it's not just college athletics telling athletes that academics aren't important. They think this already, that, oh, I've got my athletics ticket into college, and that's going to give me my ticket into the professional world. I'm going to be chilling. But athletic departments should make a huge effort to actually get athletes to engage in their academics and to understand that this is a huge opportunity to earn a 4-year degree, and the ways that that can help them be successful, but in ways that they want. Don't force them into majors that they don't want to do. So that's what I would say on that one. How would I navigate conversations when it is known that advising of student, okay, sorry, I'm having trouble reading this one, but how would I navigate conversations with advising student athletes, considering what I've mentioned? What I would say for people external to athletics is you have to instill like autonomy into athletes. You have to start to get them to think they have agency, because they do. But you have to get them to understand that not everything that their athletic academic advisor says is true or correct. Not everything their coach says is true or correct, and that they don't have to have the same wants and desires as those people, that they can have their own wants and desires. So I think a lot of it is opening opportunities to them. For me, I went into a meeting with when I was an undergrad, I went into a meeting with the person who was in charge of internship placements for psychology. And I was like, I hate this place. I want to get out of here. The school sucks. And she was like, why don't you come work with me in the diversity office? I'm gonna, mentor you essentially. And she changed my life. I was like, I hate school. I'm gonna graduate and get away from here. But she just showing me that there were things that I could do that I wanted to do changed my perspective as an athlete. Somebody asks, is there a plan to go back and redo the study to cover the limitations? So I am a PhD student and I'm finishing my second year, which is, finishing up coursework, hopefully. And I'm actually looking to propose a dissertation in a similar area because I want to really expand my understanding of how athletes across the nation, and in particular in that revenue generating zone, which you're not seeing what's in my head, but this is the United States and this is the revenue generating zone. But essentially the SEC and those like football zones that make a ton of money, I feel like I need to talk to those athletes as well because it's a very different culture over there. So yeah, I mean, I am planning on in the next 3 years, looking into this further and expanding my knowledge on identity, in particular Black identity, the ways that athletes experience it, the ways they develop it, the ways that campus resources impact that, and the ways that internal athletic department resources impact that. This is another question about gender. It's roughly the same, so I'm gonna skip that. What school did I reference? Kansas State. It's the purple one. It's not University of Kansas, it's Kansas State, which can be easily confused. But I have spent a long time studying their website and am hoping actually to make some connections there for my dissertation so I can look at their programming. I'm seeing a question, is Lamar Jackson unable to get a contract because of racism in the NFL? I'm not going to lie. As much as I study sports, I study race and sports and college in particular. And so things that happen in the professional sporting world are a little bit of a it's so far away from me. When I was watching the Super Bowl, I was like, wow, this is crazy. So unfortunately, I don't have any knowledge on the NFL, but I will look into this because there's definitely connections there. How do we engage athletic departments in this work? Thinking of student success initiatives and how to assist them in seeing how they contribute to meeting this institutional goal. Yeah, I think a lot of it is making athletic departments think that it's going to help them. So a lot of the way I've pitched it is that Black identity development does ultimately help with academic engagement. And academic engagement is going to help with NCAA compliance. Because if athletes are going to class because they like class and doing the homework because they like homework, then they're going to get the GPAs that the NCAA wants to see. So I think a lot of it is sort of, creating that interest convergence with the athletic department. But then also just if you have the bandwidth and the capacity, because I know those of us who work in higher ed and student affairs are always being asked to do things that are outside of our job descriptions, but go to the athletic departments and find somebody who's going to be your ally. When I was there, it was my coach. He found that really important. And so he would create this email list of all the Black athletes, regardless of whether they were track and field or different. And he would always send things like, oh, Black Thanksgiving is coming up in case you guys want to go. And he would really send these things to us so that we wanted to be, or we could be included. So I guess like find that person in the athletic department who wants to help you get in the door and create those relationships with athletes so that you can start to pull them in. All right, what do we got next? Did I face any barriers or pushback when proposing this research? Can I share about how supportive or not folks have been in my research process? Well, I study in the field of education. And so I actually feel like I've been so lucky to be in super humanizing and kind and loving environments. In particular, at the University of San Francisco, it's like the most soft love bubble in the School of Education there. And so I've actually been super supported in my research. I wish I had more to say there because I know sometimes it can be super complex and difficult when you're navigating research with, your institution or your advisor. But I have been partnered with universities and departments that are already trying to radicalize education. And so I think I've been lucky in that area because I think other universities or other departments would be like, no, we don't want this. All right, I'm going to go to the next question. Sorry, this one's really long. Is there dialogue among students being recruited to be cognizant of the ways that the institutions are not supportive? Okay, yeah, I would say that's the core part of this question. And then what happens to students who are ousted, essentially? When I was an athlete at Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo, I think it's still the whitest public university in California, like has the largest white population. And I think the smallest Black population as well. When we had Black athletes come visit, we would always be like, this place is horrible. It's so bad here, don't come. Or like, if you come, be aware. So we were honest, and the athletic department always was like, is there a way you guys could pitch that better? But we wanted to be honest. So I think a lot of times athletes are honest with each other about the environments they're walking into. But I also think it's hard for high schoolers to understand or transfers to understand because you're not in it. And so you don't have as like much of an understanding as the people in it do. You're like, oh, okay, yeah, like racially tense environment, whatever. And then you get there and you're like, wow, this is like really hard on my mental health. I'm really struggling to go to my classes. So I think, athletes should continue to be honest with each other and tell each other the realities of their departments, or even the areas that they're finding support and the ways that they're finding success, because that's an area that I've taken up, especially with students going to Cal Poly, is just telling them, my first 2 years were really hard because I hadn't figured it out yet. And then my last 2 years, I knew that I needed to connect with faculty of color. I needed to stay in the communities that I felt were safe for me and engage with the causes that mattered to me. So I think those are the important things there. And then in terms of athletes dropping out or having to leave their institutions because of these tensions, there really isn't support for them. And I think that's really sad. And I wish that was different. Somebody asked if I could speak on expectations of my participants and the research regarding athletic department social media channels and communications, particularly around their statements of support. So when I originally did this study, a part of what I was looking at is like are athletes engaging more in activism because institutions are actually being more receptive of activism? And that didn't come up really. That's not what my athletes were saying in my study. What I did find is they felt and recognized that the institutional engagement with Black Lives Matter was very performative and was like, putting out banners and statements and things like that. And I know that there's important work happening right now in this field, where researchers are looking now to see what athletic departments and even universities are doing. And they're seeing a steep decline, and there was all these promises and no action. So I did have a little bit of that in my study, but I focus a lot more on the internal experiences of athletes and the ways that systems impact those. But also, I think seeing yourself and seeing your causes represented is somewhat helpful, but then it's not helpful when it doesn't follow through. Okay, what's next? What recommendations would you have for universities or colleges who may not have staff and faculty representation? That is so real. That is so real. I would say connect them to other students, if possible. Connect them to community members. I know being at the University of San Francisco and connecting with the Black community in San Francisco was so important to me, so impactful to me. I felt like I had a little family and a little home while I was doing my schoolwork. And so I think any ways that you can find community members who want to volunteer or who have just any interest in being a mentor, I think that that's a good way to engage students and get them to have somebody who has their back and who has their interest in mind. How do we convince coaches that Black athletes need connection to student organizations and other campus services beyond athletics? That's a tough one. I think it's that's a really tough question. I think it's somewhat related to how do you convince athletic departments to have buy-in? How do you convince coaches to have buy-in? I think, again, it has to be a little bit of that interest convergence. How is it going to make athletes more successful in their sport? They will be more successful in their sport if they're not depressed or anxious or unsure about their racial status on their campus. That's I think very true, and that's one way. Like staff, coaches have to do a lot of these online trainings, like sexual harassment trainings, how not to say racist stuff in the workplace trainings. Athletic departments could have trainings where they talk about the importance of these things if they want to start getting coaches on board. Or outside organizations could host those things and invite coaches. But again, it's all about how you get buy-in, which is definitely difficult. Have I looked at the impact on Black coaches who are activists? I haven't, but that is such an interesting area, particularly because I think when you shift into the employment realm, it's different. And it doesn't mean that Black coaches shouldn't be able to be activists, because I think they should. But I think a lot of where I've lived in my research with students is that it is their academic right to be activists. And so I do think it's different for Black coaches, and there's already so much research happening on the underrepresentation of Black coaches in athletics. And so I think that would be such a rich area of research, because I do wonder how isolating it feels to be a Black coach or a Black athletic staff member when all these things are happening and feeling maybe like you don't have a place or a voice or a way to express yourself. So that would be super, super interesting. What resources do I recommend in getting started with developing curriculum for athletes? I would say connect with any Black student orgs. Like they're going to be most knowledgeable. I've found all of Cross's research super interesting and critical. And then as a person who works in community engagement and place-based service work, I have found that like your best curriculum is developed for the people in the exact community you're serving. And so I don't just mean like develop it for Black students, but develop it for Black students who live in this particular neighborhood in this particular city. So look at the histories, look at the ways that your students and their families and their ancestors have experienced this area, and then start just, teaching them about it. Because I think a huge problem for Black people in this country is that our histories are hidden from us. We're not allowed to learn about ourselves. And that's a whole other argument. In what ways do I hope to expand the research? Are there other regional areas that I want to look at? I definitely want to look at the revenue generating conferences, both for football and basketball, because those are the sports where we're seeing a lot of this representation, or Black representation in particular. And as I said earlier, I want to expand the research because I don't want to just look at activism. Like, activism isn't the only space that Black identity is happening. I want to look at the ways that athletes are experiencing their Black identity in the dorms, the ways that they're experiencing it in their classes, the ways that campuses are impacting them, and the ways that their identity is impacting their relationship to the campus. So I would say those things. And then one core area that I really want to look at, just based on my interviews, is I want to talk with the athletes who created these like Black athlete coalitions and things like that, and just talk to them and see how those things are going and if they've seen success. I closely follow a bunch of them on Instagram, and it just makes me so excited to see that they're hosting their own events. They're bringing speakers to talk to themselves. And so, I mean, like, I want athletic departments to do it, but athletes are doing it themselves. And so I want to talk to them and ask how it's going. Does my research include Division I non-scholarship schools? And do I think that would be different? I do think it would be different. I think that the money in Division I, or the pressure in Division I, is highly impactful. So I think that, I do think that research in athletics is often a little bit exclusionary of the lower divisions. And I think that that's not the best. I think we should look at these divisions and ensure that athletes are also having a good experience in those divisions as well. And another point there is that HBCUs are an important area of research and are also a sector of athletics that are systematically excluded from the revenue areas of college athletics. So I would like to look at HBCUs and see how Black athletes are experiencing their Black identities there, because there's already a lot of research about how Black students develop at HBCUs differently than PWIs, for sure. When bringing Black faculty members together with Black students, how do you initiate these programs? Do you individually reach out to those professors, give them the opportunity to be with a Black athlete? Do you pair people up? I actually have experience working with and researching mentoring programs when I was at Cal Poly, not specific in athletics, but just in general. And I think a lot of the way you do it is you reach out to faculty members and staff and ask if they want to sign up, and tell them about the importance, tell them what's in it for them. So get them a stipend or get them like a certificate at minimum, something that goes on their CV, but preferably real money. And then you pair them up, I would say. And it could be maybe on interest, it could be on where they're from. Yeah, just anything like that. But yeah, I would definitely say, like, if you're coming from the athletic department internally, I would say collect your staff and faculty, community members, or upperclassmen, have your pool, and then do the pairing strategically. Do I see mental health services and psychological counseling training for faculty, staff, coaches, and athletes as a strategy to improve the experience of Black athletes? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I would say a lot of my research perspective comes from psychology. That's what I got my bachelor's in. That's why my research is so focused in identity. And I think that a lot of communities of color have unique relationships to mental health resources. And so I think that's definitely a rich area of research that I want to delve into as well. And I think that my experience with mental health services is that it helps you understand yourself better, independent of all the things happening in your world. And so that's my goal for athletes, is for them to have agency and autonomy. And I absolutely think mental health services would help with that. I think one thing that for all departments on campuses is that they need to have an understanding of athletes and see why this work is important and what's unique about working with athletes and athletes of color. So I think like if CAPS or whatever it's called on various campuses, mental health services, wants to engage athletes, they need to understand what the athletic role is and start to help athletes deconstruct that. So I definitely think that's important. I'm gonna look in the chat and see if we're missing any questions there, because I actually got through them out of breath, but I got through them in the Q&A. What do I think about the alphabet soup of DEI, CRT, and then the word diversity? How does this impact the recruitment of athletes? Yeah, well, I'm definitely a person who gets irked by all the acronyms because I think I just want people to be specific and to say what they mean. And so I think, you know, the acronyms help universities in being race evasive. And I think the word diversity in particular helps universities be race evasive. And so I think within athletics, they do the same thing. We're like, oh, we value diversity, but they like value the diversity of what type of music their athletes like. And that's not diversity. And so I think that we need to be specific in what we're talking about. If you're talking about racial diversity, if you're talking about racial equity, if you're talking about anti-Blackness, be specific about what you're talking about. And I want universities to do that as well, and athletic departments. And I think that athletics is so proud that they're able to like bring in students of color. They're like, look at us, we're giving scholarships to Black people. But then they don't treat them well. They treat them like they're employees, and not even employees, because they don't give them any sort of compensation, but they treat them like laborers. And so I think that athletic departments claim diversity because they have some people of color there, but they don't focus on anti-Blackness, and they don't focus on racial equity. And that's where the words start to allow us to, you know, be race evasive and do whatever we want. I'm checking to see if there are other questions. All right, I'm going to share my contact info slide. That question is for the other panelists. Will the webinar be on the website after the fact?
That is a yes. It will take us a little bit of time, but yes, it will be available on the webinar database in I think a week.
Okay, amazing. I'm gonna add this screen share back because I was having trouble there. Here's all my contact info for anybody interested. Both of my emails for USF and Riverside, my professional Instagram, and then the two centers that I'm associated with. McCarthy Center for Public Service, and also UC Riverside Center for Athletes' Rights and Equity. Then the tiny URL there has a copy of all of these, as well as references for the entire presentation, and I'll put that in the chat for you as well. I'm seeing another question though. I'm totally happy to answer that since we have a little bit of time left. Did any of my participants utilize campus reporting measures to address incidents of racism? They didn't, no. And I do wonder if they just felt like there was nobody safe to talk to. Because it would be nice if they had felt like there was somebody they could go to. And that's something I've been looking into currently, is why aren't institutions doing something to protect the academic freedom of athletes? Do they not care? Do they not see this as an academic freedom issue? And so that's something I've been addressing recently in my writing and my research. But yeah, sadly, they did not reach out to any campus resources. Well, that is all I have for you all today. So I so appreciate the opportunity to be here and to work with NCORE again. I'm excited to be at NCORE again. I'll be talking about academic freedom at NCORE in May. So come find me if you're at NCORE. And yeah, just thank you all for coming. I'm going to pass the mic back to y'all.
Thank you very much. Justin, thank you for such a fantastic presentation and providing so much information. One of the things I'd like to say from a personal standpoint is, as a staff at NCORE, I don't always get to go to the session workshops, although I see them all come through, right? I don't always get to go. So this webinar series allows me to hear such wonderful content. Your expertise and the way that you delivered it, chef's kiss, was great. So I really appreciate working with you. I want to thank all the participants and all the attendees of this webinar. And yes, look out for our next one coming the last Wednesday in March. Have a great week, everyone, and hopefully we'll see you all in New Orleans. Bye.